All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matt Anderson. I'm the Deputy Director at the Utah Office of Energy Development. OED collaborates with many partners to achieve essential breakthroughs in infrastructure, investment, technology, and workforce development in the energy and minerals industries. Today, in partnership with Great Plains Institute, we are presenting a webinar on the introduction to carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and the opportunities associated with this technology. The webinar is divided into 4 segments. Segment 1 is presented by Matt Fry, State and Regional Policy Manager from Great Plains Institute, and Dr. Stephen Carpenter, Director of the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. They will cover the history of CCUS and its emerging technologies and opportunities. Segment 2 is presented by Michael Vandenberg, Energy and Minerals Program Manager and Senior Geologist from the Utah Geological Survey, Dr. Larry Baxter, Professor of Chemical Engineering from BYU, and Dr. Nathan Moody, Postdoctoral Research Associate from the University of Utah Energy and Geoscience Institute. They will discuss Utah's infrastructure surrounding the possibilities of CCUS. Segment 3, we'll hear from Patrice Lalem, Program Consultant with Great Plains Institute, and Clay Crozier, Eastern Utah Director for U.S. Senator Mitt Romney. They will cover federal policy and opportunities. Finally, in our 4th segment, we'll hear from Matt Fry and Representative Carl Albrecht about CCUS policies and opportunities in Utah. Representative Albrecht may be joining us via his cell phone as he's on the road for some of his legislative responsibilities, and we greatly appreciate him taking the time to join us with his busy schedule. If you have any questions during this presentation, please utilize the Q&A chat box, and your questions will be given to the presenters. Now, without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Matt Fry.
Next slide, please. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. Just wanted to, first of all, give everybody an idea of who we, Great Plains Institute, are as we kick things off. We're an independent NGO with an eye towards transforming our energy system and energy infrastructure with a focus on the environment. Next slide. Our primary management objectives at GPI are to carbon capture, provide comprehensive policy support, and support nationwide deployment of CCUS technologies. Next slide, please. Just a little more history of GPI. We've been working in this field for about 20 years, 2 decades. So we're not new to it, as it's not a new technology. So have quite a bit of experience working with states and facilitating particular events such as this. Next slide. So just bare bones, what is carbon management? I'm going to provide the 3rd grade version of this. Steve, Dr. Carpenter, is going to get more in the weeds, but basically carbon management is, first of all, where the baseline need for it is to capture source. So the carbon dioxide would be captured either from a thermal and industrial facility at the stack, or directly from the air. The next move would be potentially to put it immediately to beneficial use. And this could be either through an industrial process or a chemical process. Another opportunity would be to transport it to a location where it would be pumped into the ground, utilized for enhanced oil recovery, and then permanently stored, or just simply through straight sailing storage, geologic storage. Next slide, please. Just a little additional history here. Carbon capture, it's not new. It's been around for about 50 years. It's safe. As you can see here, there's a fairly robust list of projects that are currently or historically underway inside and outside of the US, but these are North America specific. Next slide, please. Thank you. Carbon capture from a global perspective, as you can see from this side, the footprint has expanded. Currently about 66 commercial CCUS facilities around the world, and quite a bit more in various stages of planning or deployment and development. Next slide. Just this slide just briefly talks about go back one, the potential or the fact that carbon capture has become more cost efficient over time. You can see the capture costs have reduced over time, and they'll continue to do so as we deploy additional projects. And then this final slide, I believe there's a lag on my end from the slide transfer. So go back to the previous slide, please. There. You can also see that carbon management is going to be an effective jobs developer or produce a lot of jobs over time. Next slide, please. Yeah, as indicated in this slide, we could potentially have up to 70,000 jobs for project development and up to 36,000 jobs for ongoing full-time positions across the country. And while doing that, we could manage up to about 600 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And we can provide additional information at our website there, carboncaptureready.org. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Matt. While I get that screen share unshared so I can share mine. And if you'll unshare and I'll do my, there we go. I do want to thank you for setting the stage by saying you're going to do the third grade view. I think everybody may know Robert Fulgram's book, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. I'm not going to get too much deeper than third grade because I think that level has some value. We're going to talk about some overarching aspects and hopefully set the stage for segments 2, 3, and 4 today. These are the discussion points I'm going to try and hit on, and hopefully they'll mesh together and you'll understand from an underground perspective how this makes sense. At least if you walk away with some understanding of what's going on underground today, we'll have been successful. For those of you who are old enough to remember the Beverly Hillbillies, and for those of you who are willing to admit you watched the Beverly Hillbillies, at the beginning of the show in the intro, Jed Clampett missed shooting dinner and hits the ground and oil comes out. I also happen to use the Tropicana orange commercial of an orange, and they stick a straw and say there's nothing in orange juice but oranges. If you take an orange and stick a straw in it, if you take a reservoir and drill a well and oil comes out, that's primary production. That means there's enough energy in the reservoir to produce. By penetrating that reservoir, you produce oil. And we call that primary production. At some point in time, that reservoir pressure is going to equalize with the ambient pressure at the surface, and nothing's going to come out. And so we have to repressurize that reservoir to make oil. And so we have to stick a second straw or a second well in there. And in many cases, we add things. We can add water, we can add methane to repressurize that to get the, in this case, the oil out of the ground. But we have to be mindful that when we do that, we're not just producing oil now, we're producing oil with water and methane in it, and we've got to separate it. And that has an added cost at the surface. We have to take those things that we put in to get the oil out, we got to take them back out and we sell it. And then thirdly, if you think about that orange that sat on the table or in the basket for too long and got hard, sometimes I roll it between my hands, or I throw it in the microwave for 3 or 4 seconds and reconstitute that. Tertiary production is where we're actually changing the physics of the rock. Some people tend to call that fracking. Now fracking falls within the bounds of tertiary production, but we're changing the physics of what's going on underground. We're still adding water, methane. In this case, we might add carbon dioxide. And again, because we're adding things, we've got to separate it and take it out. Because we're adding more things, it costs more money, it takes more time, it takes more energy to get those things back out of what we have going in the ground. So we've got primary, secondary, and tertiary. And many people say, why do we do all these things? And I think it's interesting, folks who don't practice oil and gas don't realize that when we go in and produce primary production, we're only getting about 1/5 of the oil out of the ground. When we do secondary production, we're getting another 1/5, less than 1/5 out. And when we do tertiary production, we're getting about 1/2 of the oil. So folks like myself and other folks that are here on the academic side who do a lot of research on technologies to get that out of the ground, if we get a 1 or 2 or 3% increase, that's a significant impact to our production and has great economic value for going forward. So let's talk about what happens underground for a minute in this white circle. On the left, you just see a cartoon where we're injecting CO2, and you see some pore space down there in the bottom. And the CO2 acts like a surfactant. Now, we tend to call it a surfactant because that's what we're used to and we see when we have Oil spills, Dawn does an awful lot of commercials removing the oil from dishwashing and removing it from animals. But the reality is that CO2 makes the oil swell. If you look at the three circles here underground, as the CO2 gets in the ground, it makes the CO2, that makes the oil swell. And when it swells, it has to go somewhere. It's basically being squeezed. And as it's squeezed through the pore space, it gets pushed up through into the production well. And so while we metaphorically call it a surfactant that it cleans and scrubs, it actually has a swelling factor in the subsurface. I want to hit the pause button now and talk about CCUS. In the beginning, and I say the beginning, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, this used to be a 3-legged milking stool: capture, transport, and storage. You went and got the CO2, you moved it, and you put it away. That's changed now for a variety of reasons. First, when the policy people and the lawyers first started doing sequestration, there was, especially in Europe, there was a struggle because the word sequestration obviously is used in jurisprudence. We sequester a jury. From a political standpoint, we sequester finances. And so there's confusion. And so about a decade or so ago, folks started saying, I don't want to call it sequestration, we're going to call it storage. It made it easier for the general public to understand. Then about 5 years ago or so, from an economics perspective of just taking the CO2 and putting it in geologic storage, there wasn't an economic driver. And CO2 EOR was the bridge that we're still in today of where's the economics to make this happen. And so we didn't want to call it CO2 EOR CCUS, and so we added a U, and so CCS became CCUS, and the utilization stood for using the CO2 for EOR, and now we've advanced it to where the utilization is actually beneficiation. How can we take that CO2 and make products? How can we do other things with it and keep it out of the ground? And then carbon dioxide, we talk about carbon dioxide and we talk about carbon in many cases, but I think in general we're referring to carbon oxide, monoxide, and carbon dioxide. And I'll use a specific example. The 45Q tax credit says carbon oxide. It doesn't say carbon dioxide, leaving open the door for additional processes that generate CO as opposed to CO2 or C that be eligible for that tax credit. So back to Matt Fry's opening stage, this is probably a 3rd grade, maybe a 2nd grade cartoon, but in general, you take an electric power plant with a big giant vacuum and you suck the carbon dioxide in and you transport it through the hose of the vacuum and you put it in some kind of subsurface storage to keep it there, quote unquote, permanently. And permanent is a relative term to geologists. That means hundreds of thousands and millions of years. From a political standpoint, permanent could mean 25, 50, 100. From a business perspective, I struggle for permanent to mean more than about 20 years. I mean, let's face it, some of the oldest companies known to us are 100, maybe 200 years old. It's hard to fathom making decisions today to stipulate that a company has to be around 500 years from now. Nobody has any idea what that's going to look like. And then lastly, from a technological standpoint, things have changed pretty significantly to the standpoint that the source of CO2, which we only used to talk about power plants. Now we look at a whole variety of institutional and industrial processes: cement creation, iron and steel, refineries, ethanol production. We look at a whole host of processes and use of materials. And then, as I mentioned, on the utilization and storage side, it's not just putting it in a saline storage in an aquifer anymore. It's using the CO2 for other things. And I'll use this graph to just set the stage for some of what my colleague is going to talk about later on in our presentation today. Generically speaking, from an electric power capture standpoint, there's 3 types of capture: post-combustion, pre-combustion, or oxy-combustion. Are you capturing the CO2 after you've burned the fuel and combusted it, i.e. are we taking it out of that smokestack? Are we taking that flue gas and trying to separate it? Are we going to try and separate that CO2 before we combust it? Or are we going to combust it without flame, but in a oxygen-rich environment? All three of those have advantages and disadvantages of cost, process, and materials required to do that. And then once you have your capture technology, you have to look at what are the routes. Are we using absorption, adsorption? Are we looking at different kinds of applications of membranes? And now you have nanomaterials. The chemical looping side on the reforming is where we get our hydrogen production from. And in many cases, you may be aware of entities like the Wyoming Integrated Test Center or the National Carbon Capture Center that's sponsored by Southern Company and the DOE that provide research opportunities for folks with technologies to come in and figure out what's the best way and place to do this. So we've got our capture, our CO2, our CO, our carbon captured somewhere, and we've got to move it from point A to point B. I think we all would agree that from a natural gas standpoint and an oil and gas standpoint, we understand and accept pipelines. There's about 3 million miles of natural gas transportation pipelines and gathering lines, both inter and intrastate. Ironically, there's about less than 5,000 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines, focused primarily in the Rocky Mountain region and the Gulf Coast, for obvious reasons in the oil and gas industry. But there are orders of magnitude fewer miles of carbon dioxide pipelines than there are natural gas pipelines. Then we have to talk about how we're going to get that CO2 into the ground. Typically in oil and gas, a CO2 EOR, we use what's called a Class 2, an underground injection control or a UIC Class 2 well, which is on the right. That's just a graphic of what we showed with the orange and the straw. And those wells, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those wells in the United States. And generically speaking, they cost on the order of magnitude of a couple $100,000 to install, depending on how deep they are in the diameter of that well. Conversely, the Class 6 wells, which are designed specifically and solely for CO2 storage, there are very few. There are only 4 permits today that exist. There are lots of states that are advancing that, but we're talking about single digits to tens of permitted wells, and those wells cost millions of dollars, order of magnitude more, to install. So if you look at the value chain of capture, transport, and storage, there's a variety of things that are going on. You have to look at what technology you're going to use and the maturity of that. Obviously, most of the costs today are in the technology side on the capture piece. Those costs are coming down, but that's still the lion's share of the cost of the projects. You have to look at, what's known as the cost of electricity for compression and the separation costs. What are you going to take away from that power plant's ability to produce electricity to put on and run and operate those capture facilities? And then how are you going to get the CO2 from point A to point B across state lines in many cases? And where are you going to put it underground? Is it a Class 6 well? Is it going to be a Class 2 well? What kind of surveillance are you going to do to look at and monitor and ensure that the CO2 is where you put it? And then the black sign with the dollar sign in it, who's going to pay for it? How is it going to get paid for over what period of time? The 45Q, which our colleagues will talk about later today, has a finite lifetime, 12 years, potentially being extended with movement of Congress, but it has limits. And so the question that needs to be asked is, who pays for this? So I'm going to share with you my last slide here, the upside and the downside. When we commercialize and talk about getting a CO2 CCUS commercialized, we have to ask ourselves questions. And the first question I ask is source to sink. What I mean by that is, you look at the graph in the middle, which is this, on the left, a Class 6 well. When the EPA designed those, even the graphic shows that. If you see the power plant here in the top of the graphic, the expectation was that a well would be drilled in proximity to where the CO2 source was. Well, the reality is that's not necessarily the case. There are lots of power plants. There's lots of CO2 sources in the Northeast, Obviously, the granite state is known as the granite state for a reason. Its subsurface rock is granite, and you're not going to be able to put CO2 underground in much of the Northeast, in much of the Mid-Atlantic, in much of California. So how are you going to move those sources of CO2 to the places where they need to go? In a class 6 well or a class 2 well? Are you going to convert class 2 wells and CO2 EOR up to class 6? Are you going to do new greenfield sites, or are we going to talk about converting old oil fields or other facilities, industrial facilities, brownfields? Do we do this regionally, or do we do it nationally? Are we going to allow the feds to permit all this, or are states going to talk about primacy? The state of North Dakota and Wyoming have class 6 primacy. States of Texas and Louisiana have applied for primacy, which means the states get to action the evaluation and issuance of class 6 UIC permits, and can be done more quickly and with more specificity to those specific states. Depending on how far we're going to move the CO2, do we have to compress it? Are we going to keep it in a gaseous state? Are we going to compress it to supercritical CO2 so it flows like a liquid? But there are costs associated with compressing those. And who owns the pore space and is responsible for the liability underneath? The downside is there's a bunch of questions to be answered. The upside is states, entities, like those of you are here today, are in many cases in control of answering those questions. And for your state can say, for us, it makes sense to do X, Y, and Z, and hopefully can advance some of those quicker than having to wait for the feds to answer those questions. With that, I will pause. I think we're going to hold questions till the end. Appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. Now we're going to introduce the Utah infrastructure segment with Richard Esser from Carbon Science Engineering Research Laboratory Manager with the Energy and Geoscience Institute, Dr. Nathan Moody, Postdoctoral Research Associate, also with EGI, Michael Vanderberg, Energy and Minerals Program Manager and Senior Geologist from Utah Geological Survey, and Dr. Larry Baxter, Professor of Chemical Engineering from Brigham Young University.
Okay, I think we can go next slide. All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Rich Esser. I am the Managing Director of the Carbon Science Initiative at the Energy and Geoscience Institute at the University of Utah. We're going to do a little bit of a tag team today for the Utah infrastructure. Myself and Dr. Nate Moody, Michael Vandenberg, and Dr. Larry Baxter are going to be covering infrastructure in the state of Utah. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview of what we're going to be covering. I will be looking at some of the history of CCUS research, both in the state of Utah and outside the state of Utah, but significantly conducted by state of Utah personnel. And then Mike Vandenberg is going to be looking at the sources of CO2 within the state and potential geologic sinks in the state of Utah. We'll quickly cover existing pipelines and rights of way, and then we'll turn the mic over to Dr. Larry Baxter to look at some of the capture technology that Sustainable Energy Solutions has been working on. Next slide, please. So Utah was early into the carbon storage research game. The Utah Geological Survey and its director at the time, Dr. Rick Ellis, in 2001 and 2003 evaluated CO2 sources within the state of Utah. And that's both anthropogenic and natural, as well as a lot of potential sinks and transportation options, namely pipelines. The Utah Geological Survey has been involved with state CO2 storage assessments and related projects ever since. The Energy and Geoscience Institute at the University of Utah has led and participated in many CO2 storage and feasibility projects since 2003 with the UGS and BYU as significant partners. So today we'll talk about, just kind of give you a quick overview of 3 of these projects today, namely the Southwest Carbon Partnership, the Carbon Utilization and Storage Partnership, and Carbon Safe Utah project. The others are still significant, including a site characterization project near the Uinta Basin in Utah, and another carbon safe project in the Four Corners region of New Mexico. The portfolio I'm listing here represents over $100 million of Department of Energy investments into CCUS. Next slide, please. So the Southwest Carbon Partnership, or SWP, is one of the 7 original regional carbon sequestration partnerships in the United States, funded by the Department of Energy in 2003. It's a long-term project separated into 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 was a paper study looking into CO2 sources and storage options. Phase 2 saw 3 pilot-scale CO2 injection tests. And phase 3, and that's ongoing right now since 2013, focuses on a single site with commercial scale volumes of CO2 injected. Next slide, please. The phase 2 pilot scale projects in the SWP that I mentioned focused on enhanced oil recovery and enhanced coal bed methane recovery. Steve Carpenter gave a very nice overview of both of those. Primarily because industry partners were needed and oil and gas companies were the ones that were injecting CO2 for fossil fuel recovery. One of these partners was Resolute Energy with their CO2 EOR operation at the Aneth field in the Paradox Basin in southern Utah. The SWP project evaluated almost 300,000 tons of CO2 injected at Aneth over a 2-year period. Next slide, please. So the SWP pilot projects were useful for moving to commercial scale CO2 injection and storage, and commercial scale here is in excess of 1 million metric tons injected per year. For reference, the Hunter Power Plant in Castledale emits just shy of 10 million metric tons per year. Phase 3 of the SWP project is that commercial scale storage. Next slide, please. So the SWP originally attempted to site its phase 3 project, its commercial scale project in Utah, first at the Farnham Dome project just outside of Price, and later at Gordon Creek, just to the southwest of Price. For a few reasons, the project was unable to make those work, and the partnership found an EOR site in the Texas Panhandle. The Farnsworth unit is a carbon capture, utilization, and storage project. CO2 is sourced from 2 anthropogenic sources: the Archelon ethanol plant in Liberal, Kansas, and the Agrium fertilizer plant in Borger, Texas. Over 100 miles of pipeline connect the 2 sources to 3 currently active enhanced oil recovery projects. The SWP has been performing the comprehensive characterization, modeling and simulation, and monitoring activities at the site since 2013, and actually will continue well past 2023. Next slide, please. The general goals of the SWP Phase 3 project at the Farnsworth unit are relevant to any large-scale CO2 storage project, whether it is CO2 EOR or pure saline storage. The overarching goal is to take the knowledge from the Farnsworth unit project and be able to transfer it to many other sites in the southwestern United States and Utah, basically to act as a blueprint that is applicable to almost anywhere. And with the Farnsworth unit as an EOR site, it has direct applications to EOR activities in the Uinta Basin and the Paradox Basin. Next slide, please. So here we are in 2021. The SWP, as I mentioned, is an R&D project. It's winding down and giving way to commercialization opportunities. So the CUSP, that's the Carbon Utilization and Storage Partnership, is the next iteration of the regional carbon sequestration partnerships funded by the DOE and NETL in 2019. The goals of the CUSP project are to accelerate onshore CCUS deployment in the Western US by addressing gaps, particularly those relevant to industry stakeholders, oil and gas companies in particular, energy companies in particular, those that will actually capture and store CO2. Next slide, please. And stakeholders are indeed showing great interest. The game changer, as Steve mentioned, was the 45Q tax credit. That's up to $35 a ton of CO2 stored for EOR and up to $50 a ton of CO2 stored in a saline aquifer. Companies from Washington to Texas are expressing great interest in those 45Q tax credits, and several companies already in Utah are communicating with us to capture and store CO2 in the state. Next slide, please. And I think at that point, I will turn it over to Dr. Nate Moody at the University of Utah.
Thanks, Rich. I wanted to take a little bit of a step back in time, back to being end of 2016, beginning of 2017. We got a project from the Department of Energy to look at safe storage of CO2 from a coal-fired power plant. And the name of the project, of course, was Carbon Safe Rocky Mountain Phase 1. And we were charged with looking at a pre-feasibility study of storing 50 million tons from a coal-fired power plant. And so we looked at a couple areas and focused in on central Utah on the Hunter and Huntington power plants, and really wanted to kind of address a lot of the questions that were coming up with the ability to store and if it's economically feasible and such. And so we needed to develop a plan to address these challenges that we're going to face for any CCS type operation. And really, we also were looking at liability minimization and indemnification as well. That was fairly important, along with the site assessment and characterization and the source assessment and transport. So we did a really high level technical, what we call the technical sub-basin evaluation, where we looked at the resources under the Colorado Plateau near the city of the town of Price and Castledale in central Utah. And those Castledale's right near where the Hunter power plant is. And so we wanted to look at those the resources under that area and see if there was the ability to store the emissions that were coming from these two sites in the local area without much, with minimization of transport length and cost and such. And so we had a couple of different tools we used. We built geologic models. We characterized the site, or I should say, we characterized the site. We built geologic models, numerical models for detailed reservoir simulations to understand the details of the fluid flow and pressure buildup and such. And then used some tools from CCUS and NRAP to help understand the economics and the risk of the site. And so we go to the next slide, please. And so we did a fairly detailed characterization of the site in the limited time we had. It was about a 2-year project. And so not a lot of time to do a detailed characterization, but it is a pre-feasibility study. And so we looked at 2 specific sites. We looked at this site called Buzzard's Bench. And a little bit south of that, you can see there's a little red triangle on this map on the right, and that was our potential injection site in the Buzzard Bench area. And then we looked at a site further north in what was called the Drunkard's Wash Field. Both of these sites had really favorable subsurface geology. Initially, we thought the white rim sandstone was going to be our target, but initial characterization ruled that one out. But brought to light that the Navajo sandstone, which is really ubiquitous throughout this area, turned out to be a really good target. And so what we're showing here on this little map, just to orient you, is we have the Huntington power plant here in the north and the Hunter power plant down here in the south. And we kind of came up with two different storage sites, one about 13 miles from the Hunter power plant and one a bit further north. It was, I think, a little over 40 miles, I believe, up to this injection site. And we looked at the cost of transporting that CO2 through pipelines and such. What we were really after was we needed to find a place to store that 50 million tons of CO2 that we would capture over the lifetime of the project if it went forward. And so we have this nice, on the left here, a regional base, kind of a basin scale sequestration model that we had built to address this problem. And if we go to the next slide, please. And so we needed to understand a little bit about some of the capture or the flue gas composition of our 2 power plants. And so, like I said, Hunter power plant was our initial site. And so they are burning about 4.3 million short tons of bituminous coal every year. And that generates, like we'd indicated earlier, about just under 10 million tons of CO2. These are 2015 numbers. And so we wanted to look at capture from one of their units, which turned out to be about 2.7 million tons, 2.75. And when it was all said and done, we had a mean capture cost of around just over $37. And I didn't put this on here, but a cryogenic capture cost that was a little bit higher, around $45.50 or so. And that was working with Dr. Larry Baxter at BYU. And so he'll talk a little bit more later on about the cryogenic capture that we studied on this. But both of those dollar numbers, as you'll realize from Dr. Carpenter's presentation are below the $50 a ton 45Q tax credit. So these would have been good options for that 45Q. So I guess let me back up. We were not trying to store this in an oil and gas field, but in a deep saline. So the Navajo sandstone in this area is a deep saline reservoir. And just a little bit about the Huntington power plant. We did look at this, but we didn't end up doing a really detailed study on this one because of we chose to focus on our primary site, the Hunter power plant. But as you can see, they had basically the same flue gas composition because they're both burning the same coal. Huntington's just burning quite a bit less, generates only about 5.6 million tons of CO2 a year. But overall, you would have to go in there, clean up that CO2 because it's only about 11 or 12% of the flue gas. Clean it up, separate it from the nitrogen, oxygen, and other impurities, compress that, and then transport it to our injection site. And so that all adds a bit of cost, as we've seen in here, but it did seem feasible to us. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so kind of the results of our site assessment was that there's definitely sufficient capacity in this area, well in excess of the 50 million tons that we actually wanted to store. I've since done some simulations of storage in the area, trying to maximize the amount of CO2 that I could get there with by using existing wells, and was able to get over 1 billion tons of CO2, which equated to what Utah emits over about a 100-year period, with both their power generation, cement, petroleum manufacturing, steel. I think there was a steel plant, ethanol plant as well. And so we were able to gather all of those emissions and able to capture those and sequester it within this site. So it's quite interesting. But in addition to that, not only does the Navajo sandstone have the capacity, but there's underlying layers that we've indicated here, the Wingate and the Cayente, which directly underlie the Navajo sandstone. And those also end up being reservoirs for CO2 because of their high permeability and porosity, especially the Wingate, the Cayente, not so much. And we also, using these NRAP tools, which assess the potential leakage that you may see of CO2 through abandoned well bores, we were able to identify very few wells. That's these blue stars that you see on the left. These are wells that penetrate the Navajo and that we would have to assess for any type of Class 6 well. And there was just a few. And we realized that doing the analysis, less than 1,600 tons of CO2 would leak from either of these sites over a 100-year period if there was an open well bore for that to leak through. So not even just like a closed well, but a fairly open channel from the reservoir to the surface. So in a real world scenario where you have good well control and you've plugged your wells well and at least catalog and know which ones may be potential to leak, you should be able to minimize this to basically zero. And then another great result was that this AOR, which is our area of review, this is the area where the pressure would cause these wells to possibly leak, stays very localized around the wells. We don't see much movement away from wells. So we have 50 million tons and we get this area down here. We had a bit of movement towards the east, which is towards where some of these formations may outcrop a number of miles away. But up here in the north, this was our secondary site, and this turned out to be actually our best option. We had the least movement of the CO2 plumes, no potential for leakage through any outcrops or such, and very minimal leakage through any of the wells. So overall, it was really a pretty cool study that we did, and it highlights that this area actually may end up being a really good hub for CO2 storage for regionally, because this area up here in the north has huge potential for CO2 storage. There's just lots and lots of pore space up there. And it I should mention, it underlies an existing natural gas field, the Drunkard's Wash field. And so there's already existing infrastructure along here that we could take advantage of to help reduce the costs and such. So with this, I'll pass this over to Mike Vandenberg with the next slide, I think. Oh, sorry. No, this was I got one more. Sorry, Mike. Just to wrap this up, this is the sequestration potential that we have here in Utah from our previous work. And so as you can see, they have these two big circles that kind of overlap each other are the Hunter and Huntington power plants. And then all of the blue squares are our sequestration potential, whether that be deep saline or oil and gas, such as EOR fields or such. And so you can see Utah has quite a bit of potential, and this is just what we have identified so far. Really, there's probably quite a bit more than this that we could take advantage of. And so there's great potential to leverage this 45Q tax credits for companies in our state. So I think with that, then I can pass this over to Mike. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nate. So as a way of introduction, my name is Mike Vandenberg. I'm the Energy and Minerals Program Manager at the Utah Geological Survey. And of course, being in charge of a bunch of energy-related geologists, we're mostly involved in the sequestration part of the carbon capture, utilization, sequestration. So next slide there. Just highlighting the sequestration and oh, can you go back? Thank you. The map on the right is the one that Nate was just talking about and showing. And this was created probably about 15 years ago when we did an initial assessment of potential storage capacity in the state of Utah. And it was part of a program called NatCarb, which was related to the Southwest Partnership. As part of the new CUSP initiative, we will be greatly expanding the data behind this map and fully expect to extend a lot of this storage capacity or potential places for CO2 storage almost statewide. Okay, next slide. So I have about 5 minutes to talk about all the sources of CO2 in Utah and all the sinks of CO2 in Utah. So bear with me. This will be a pretty high level 30,000 foot overview. Feel free to reach out if you want more specifics at a later time. So let's start off with CO2 sources in Utah. And this data is really available to anybody. This is the EPA flight data, which facilities, power plants in the state of Utah and all across the United States have to report their CO2 equivalent emissions to the EPA. They just came out with their 2020 data just a couple of weeks ago. So anybody can go and pull this data and graph it, or they can make maps with it or anything. So that's all I really did. And you can see the pie chart on the left is all reporting facilities to the EPA. And you can see, of course, it's dominated by the coal-fired power plants. 68% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Utah come from coal-fired power plants. It's not a huge surprise. The next largest component is natural gas power plants. And then we have refineries. We have 5 refineries in North Salt Lake. We have 3 cement lime plant facilities in the state, and then it kind of just goes down from there. The map is something I just put together showing the facilities that actually qualify for the 45Q tax credit. So of course you have the coal-fired power plants, which are the larger blue circles. There are 4 of them. And then you have there's 2 natural gas plants, and then the triangles, the green triangles, are all the manufacturing facilities or the refineries, or basically everything else. The black circles and triangles are facilities that emit greenhouse gas emissions, but right now they don't emit enough to qualify for the Q45. Or the 45Q, sorry. Okay, next slide. So in the state of Utah, there are 20 qualifying facilities right now. And again, you see at the top of this chart, they're dominated by the 4 large coal burning power plants in the state. And you can see I did list the thresholds there. So for an electric generation facility, they have to emit more than 500,000 tons of CO2 equivalent each year. And then for an industrial facility, that it reduces down to 100,000 tons. Unless there is a beneficial use of the CO2, not including EOR, then it drops down even further. However, there is legislation, pending legislation or suggested legislation to eliminate some of these thresholds. But this is where we are right now. So you have the 4 large coal burning power plants. In the state of Utah, we actually have 15 natural gas power plants, but only 2 of them qualify under this criteria for the 45Q. The vast majority of the natural gas power plants in the state of Utah are peaker plants. So they typically only run at about a 20 to 30% capacity factor. So maybe down the road, if these become more base load plants, maybe they will emit more and be able to qualify. And then you have these other facilities that are all less than 100,000 tons. Like the cement or lime plants, the refineries, and so forth. Next. So as I think everybody is probably familiar, the IPP plant is shutting down in the next couple of years. So that one's going to be off the table. It's converting to a natural gas / hydrogen power plant. And even Rocky Mountain Power has suggested that the Huntington plant might be phased out in maybe the 10-year timeframe. Next. Okay, let's switch now to sinks, or areas in Utah where you can actually sequester the CO2. My group at the Utah Geological Survey, a lot of us are petroleum geologists, and the same expertise you need to study petroleum and extract petroleum or natural gas from the subsurface are the same expertise you need to study whether or not you can sequester the CO2 underground. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So there's 2 exceptions. One, we don't care about a source, of course. And we also don't care about timing and migration of the hydrocarbons from that source. So really all we're interested in is the reservoir, the seal, and the trap. And the expertise needed to evaluate those are, again, similar to petroleum geology, the sedimentology stratigraphy, the structure of the basin, which means the faulting, the fractures, basin analysis, and the modeling. And this is where our partnership with EGI comes into play. A lot of times we provide the geologic expertise to looking at these reservoirs, and then folks like Nate and Rich Esser then take it and do all the sophisticated modeling at EGI. Next slide. So potential sinks. So one great thing about Utah is we have an abundance of potential carbon sequestration sinks in the state. And so I've listed several here. The map, of course, it shows those sources again. It also shows the current oil and gas fields in the state of Utah. So number 1 there, current oil and gas fields, you could sequester CO2 and maybe use it for enhanced oil recovery. We talked briefly, and Nate already mentioned the Navajo Nugget Sandstone is available in several parts of the state and makes a wonderful sequestration target. You have the Leadville, other sandstone units, you have coal bearing strata, you have the Wasatch Mesa Verde, other carbonates, and it goes on and on and on. Next slide. So bottom line is there's potential for CO2 sequestration almost everywhere in the state of Utah. So I wouldn't say 100%, but you're not going to sequester CO2, say, in the high Uintas, but wherever you have sedimentary rocks, there is potential for carbon sequestration. So that's great news for the state of Utah. Go to the next slide. So again, sticking with just this is a high level overview, I'm going to just show a few examples of some of the sequestration targets that we've been studying over the years or have a lot of potential. So of course, the first one is the Navajo Sandstone. I think everybody's familiar with Navajo Sandstone. It's the rocks. If you go down to Zion National Park, or if you go to Snow Canyon State Park, or if you go to Grand Staircase, a lot of beautiful Navajo outcrops are exposed. And Navajo is an ancient dune system. So of course is these sand grains, and you can see in this photomicrograph, these rounded sand grains, and all the blue in that photomicrograph is pore space. So lots of porosity, 20–30% porosity, lots of permeability in these rocks. And a lot of times the Navajo already has saline water in it. So it is appropriate for injection of CO2. So the circles on the map in the lower right are just some of the areas where the Navajo is present in the subsurface and could be used for carbon sequestration. Next. So another target, and this one's pretty localized to the Paradox Basin in the southeastern part of Utah, is the Leadville limestone, often called the Red Wall in some other places. If you go down to the Grand Canyon, it'll be called the Red Wall. But this is a large carbonate reservoir that has, again, a lot of porosity, a lot of permeability, and a lot of potential for carbon sequestration. Next slide. And I want to highlight, of course, the Uinta Basin. Uinta Basin, it produces 80% of the oil and gas in the state of Utah currently. The oil fields, which are in blue on the map on the left, or sorry, not blue, green on the map on the left, are producing oil out of the Green River Formation, and there is potential for enhanced oil recovery in some of these Green River Formation rocks, even looking at some of the new horizontal wells and injecting in a horizontal well, pushing oil to another horizontal. I call out EOR in unconventional rocks, which hasn't really been done before, but is something that we've been talking about and thinking about. Then, of course, you have the gas fields. You have the Wasatch Mesa Verde, prolific gas fields, but they also already serve as saline aquifers for produced water disposal and would make perfect formations for CO2 sequestration as well. And that Natural Buttes field, which is the large red polygon on the map, our largest producer of natural gas. You could almost imagine maybe putting in a natural gas power plant in that same area. You'd have lots of access to CO2 sequestration opportunities back into the Wasatch Mesa Verde in the subsurface. Next slide. And one of the great resources of information at the Utah Geological Survey is the Utah Core Research Center. So to understand all of these potential reservoir units and whether or not they're suitable for carbon sequestration, of course, you need rock, you need core material. And the Utah Core Research Center houses core from 1,500 plus wells across the state of Utah, many of them with CO2 sequestration potential. And so this will be the first place that anybody should stop if they're looking at evaluating potential reservoirs across the state. I think that is all of my slides, and I think we're kicking it back to Rich Esser to talk a little bit about the transportation of CO2.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This is Rich Esser. Yeah, I won't spend long on this because I know Larry Baxter has got a good presentation to give. So CO2 transport in Utah is primarily pipelines. As Steve pointed out, Utah does have a large network of existing oil and gas pipelines. Only a few CO2 pipelines, namely up by the Uinta Basin. It's really just a pipeline from Chute Creek to the Rangeley Field in Colorado. It just passes through Utah. And then in the southeastern corner, I mentioned the Aneth oil field for enhanced oil recovery. There's a short CO2 pipeline spur coming from McElmo Dome. That's really it for CO2 pipelines. But really the benefit of all the other pipelines are the existing rights of way and the availability of those rights of way for minimizing any regulatory issues with putting in new CO2 pipelines. So with that, I am going to turn the mic over to Dr. Larry Baxter at Brigham Young University and Sustainable Energy Solutions.
Great, thank you for the time. I'll try to go through this quickly. So I am a professor at Brigham Young University, chemical engineering professor, and also the inventor and co-founder of company for the cryogenic carbon capture technology. And I'll talk about that, but also talk about that in association with some other presentations. So next slide. Will mentioned that Sustainable Energy Solutions was recently, meaning in December, acquired by Chart Industries, which is a multinational company. In some ways, for those who are looking for job creation and other things, you can mark a fairly major win down here already. So SES is now part of Chart. We employ over a dozen highly compensated engineers and another 10 or so other people that are either part-time or full-time, but not permanent. Payroll of about a couple $1 million a year. So Chart is an equipment manufacturer with a focus on cryogenic carbon capture systems. And what I'll talk about mainly is our cryogenic carbon capture system that we're developing. It's about a $40 million investment in terms of past and current projects in this, with 60 issued patents and about 30 more in review. We have a skid scale system of this, and I'll illustrate that briefly. That's been tested in the US and abroad. It's actually just finishing from a literal world, around the world tour where it's coming back. I think it's stuck outside of Los Angeles right now on a ship, and we'll be back here in Utah shortly. So I will, let's see, next slide, please. So this is just to mention, we're moving kind of upstream now. We've talked mostly in this presentation about the transport and injection storage issues. Now I'm going to focus on the separation issues. When we do the separation and the costing that you'll see, we include all the costs, estimated costs of downstream storage in saline aquifers in order to do those comparisons. But our expertise is in the separation process, which, as was mentioned earlier, is the bulk of the cost, and I would say even more of the technical risk of this overall process. So next slide. So our process is actually quite simple. We just cool the flue gas down, as is shown here, go through a heat exchanger, cool it down to the point that we get a phase separation between the CO2 and the other gases. The light gases, both the CO2 and the light gases, we warm back up again. And we warm it up by cooling the other gases down. So there's actually almost no traditional refrigeration, just heat integration in this process. But one of the important things to recognize is as we cool the flue gas down, because of the thermodynamics of most CO2 and light gases, if it's less than about 18% concentration, there is no temperature or pressure at which you can get the CO2 in that mixture to form a liquid. So it comes out as either a solid or a gas. So we solidify it, form dry ice. The solids are pressurized and then warmed back up. And because they're pressurized, and now they're pure CO2, they form a liquid, and we deliver a pure liquid product as CO2 or light gases that it is vented from the atmosphere. So next slide. Now that video that you saw on the right is the solid CO2 that's melting in one portion of the process here. So the dry ice and the solid that you see there are dry ice, and the liquid is liquid CO2 at about a negative 53 degrees Celsius. So next slide. So some of the benefits is the CCC process has, we think, by far the lowest energy and cost of any retrofit technology. We would say that's probably true of greenfield technology again. So I heard some numbers earlier, and I'm not sure where they came from, but I will push back a little bit on those. We're quite confident if we do we've done this many times with third parties, and quite confident that we would be able to quite handily get lower costs than a solvent-based system. However, many of the systems, including the solvent-based system, become difficult, and they're easier to install in greenfield applications than they are in retrofit applications. But the vast majority of the demand is going to be in retrofit applications, and we have basically a bolt-on technology which requires no upstream modifications. It produces a high purity liquid CO2 We have produced and can produce CO2 that meets beverage grade standards, which are the highest standards there are. It's capable of and operates typically at quite high capture rates, capable of very high capture rates. We can run it at negative emissions rates, that is, capture all of the CO2 from a coal-fired power plant, for example, and some of the CO2 that enters the plant with the air. And it has a very substantial grid scale energy storage potential. I'm not going to have time to talk about most of those things, but I'll hit a few highlights in the next few slides. So, next slide. This has been reviewed, as I said, by many people. One of the people is not involved with the development at all. It's Howard Herzog. He's the director of the MIT Energy Initiative, actually just retired. But he's written in several public places that of all the carbon capture processes, he regards this cryogenic carbon capture process to have the greatest potential. And if we just go to the next slide. So we've worked with a lot of people, including Chart and others. This is a pretty typical energy comparison. This is based upon published and highly detailed numbers from the Department of Energy with the amine technologies on the right, showing both the cost of capture and the energy penalty associated, energy penalty expressed as a fraction of the output of a power plant that is consumed by the carbon capture process. And compare that with the cryogenic carbon capture process on the left. This one is, we used all the same software, all the same techniques, the same economic and technical assumptions in terms of efficiencies. And this is fairly typical of the way things turn out in these analyses. Next slide, please. So I mentioned we have a skid scale system. It's been around the world. Hunter Power Plant has been mentioned several times. This is our skid scale system, was set up for about 6-7 months, I guess, at the Hunter Power Plant in Utah. The 3 blue containers, shipping containers you see there, house the carbon capture system, and the other unit is the control room and housing for the people that were running the system while I was down there. On the right, you can see a little bit more detail of the system that goes through this process. It's been to cement kilns, power plants, heating plants. It's captured CO2 from biomass and coal and natural gas and shredded tires and fuel oils, heavy residual fuel oil. It's probably about the most thoroughly tested technology that there is in all of those things. And if you'll go to the next and I think the last slide. So we recently announced that we're starting our first commercial system, which will be a small commercial system, 30 tons per day, to produce liquid CO2 at a cement plant in this case in Missouri. That project formally starts in January. Just finalizing all the last details of it now. Chart Industries this will be the first one Chart's done with us, and it will demonstrate at a small commercial scale. So markets for CO2 utilization other than EOR are relatively small, and this is about the right size of a plant to address a local or regional market for CO2. But if you're going to capture enough CO2 to capture from a utility scale power plant, then you need to be about 100 times this size. And we have plans for the next version of this to scale up, but those aren't finalized yet, and they will depend upon the outcomes of this plant. And there's probably one more about this size that we'll announce before the end of the year. So with that, some acknowledgements. There's a bunch of people at SES and project supporters and sponsors, which include the federal government to a relatively small extent, about 30% of the total cost. The rest of it has come from states or Chart or industries or other people around the world, from several places in Europe and the Middle East, and United States and Canada. And there's a bunch of engineers that made all of this work so far, and appreciate Brigham Young University's cooperation as well. So I think that's all we had. If on to the next part of the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Baxter. And thank you, everybody, for a great presentation. Now we will continue with an overview on state policy. Emma, I think we will continue with the overview of federal policy presented by Patrice Lalonde, program consultant from Great Plains Institute, and Clay Crozier, Eastern Utah Director of, Utah Director for the United States, Senator Mitt Romney.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrice Lalonde, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I think Emma is just getting to the appropriate part of the slide deck so we can get underway. Just by way of background, I work with our carbon management team at the Institute. Matt Fry gave a little bit of background about GPI. We work across policy areas at the state and regional level, which is part of our cooperative effort here with the Utah Department of Energy to put on this webinar today. We also work at the federal level with the Carbon Capture Coalition. We facilitate that group. And then we also have a project that's focused on industrial decarbonization as well. So those are kind of the primary areas that we are working in. So this is just a Venn diagram that kind of shows the intersection of all of our work. And, essentially what we want to see is a state, regional, and federal coordination to create an infrastructure for policy development and advocacy around carbon management technologies and policies. So you can go to the next slide, please. So my focus today is really going to be on the federal landscape and the perspective from the Carbon Capture Coalition. So it is, really an unprecedented national coalition. They operate on consensus, and the singular goal is to achieve economy-wide deployment of a full suite of carbon management options, including the full chain: carbon capture, removal, transport, utilization, and storage. We really unite diverse interests for a common purpose. You have energy companies, ethanol producers, labor unions, conservation groups, all at the table to help achieve the same goal. There's currently over 80 members of the coalition, and they are hard at work right now, especially with where things stand in federal negotiations. Next slide. So earlier this year, the Carbon Capture Coalition published its second federal policy blueprint. And, again, just to underscore the unique nature of this coalition, they operate by consensus and developed an entire framework around supporting investment certainty for project finance and feasibility, technology-related recommendations, recommendations around transport, storage, and infrastructure and market development, and then also recommendations relating to jobs, economic development, looking at impacts to affected communities. And that was all published as part of the federal policy blueprint. And I will go ahead and put that link in the chat here when my presentation concludes. Next slide. And then with the federal policy blueprint as a foundation, it became clear that there were going to be opportunities to help achieve some of the policy priorities that had been identified in that blueprint as part of the 117th Congress. And so the list that you see on your screen right now, more than 90% of what we have been advocating for on the federal level is included in part of the budget reconciliation text that is currently in play at the moment. In addition, I'll get into a little more detail about what was just passed by the House of Representatives late Friday night as far as the bipartisan infrastructure package. But providing a direct pay option to monetize the federal 45Q tax credit is a key provision, and that is retained in the text of the House version of budget reconciliation currently. The same with the extension of the commence construction window. Also enhanced credit values for the 45Q tax credit across many technologies. So what's in play right now is for direct air capture. If you're going to store CO2 in saline formations, it's $180 is the tax credit amount as part of budget reconciliation, $130 for direct air capture utilizing EOR, and then $85 a ton for power and industry that are storing as part of in a saline formation. And $60 for utilization and $60 for enhanced oil recovery. We are currently working also to, in this slide, it notes that we are hoping to eliminate the annual carbon capture thresholds. A presenter earlier noted that there are several gas plants, power plants, others in the state of Utah that are not currently eligible to for the 45Q tax credit based on threshold levels. So right now, the budget reconciliation text includes a significant reduction in the carbon capture thresholds, 12,500 metric tons for industrial plants and 18,250 metric tons for power. The one remaining issue that we're trying to really work on is, unfortunately, the reconciliation text would require that a power plant only would need to capture 75% of its emissions annually in order to qualify for the tax credit. And we are working with House and Senate partners to try to address those issues. Next slide. So this is a snapshot of the infrastructure bill that passed the House by a vote of 228 to 206 on Friday evening. It includes the full text of what's called the SCALE Act, which provides more than $4 billion in funding aimed at CO2 transport and infrastructure. It also, for the first time, includes money for direct air capture hubs and hydrogen hubs, a direct air capture prize, and additional money for demonstration. Next slide. So this is a little bit more of a deeper dive on the monetary amounts that are included as part of the Infrastructure Act, and we'll make sure to provide this slide deck out to folks so you have this information going forward. Next slide, please. So, the infrastructure bill passing is great news. Obviously, we hope also to see budget reconciliation move forward. Those two pieces of legislation really do include the vast majority of the priorities on carbon management that the Carbon Capture Coalition and others have been seeking. And it could result in a 13-fold scale up of carbon management capacity across the US. And really substantial emissions reductions, not to mention the jobs element of this, both in creating new family sustaining wages and jobs, but also preserving some. So there's just really billions of dollars in investment opportunities that this could potentially unleash. And if, what is included or what hopefully passes as part of the budget reconciliation measure, it would really be globally transformative. It would be the most robust policy for carbon management across the world today. So there are a lot of people watching what's happening. Next slide, please. So what's next? So the action in the House of Representatives on Friday night, there was some compromise made, I think, by some factions of the Democratic Party. But essentially what they're waiting for now, or hanging their hat on, is the release of an official score of the legislation from the Congressional Budget Office. Now, keep in mind that there are 1,600 pages of text. And the text changed, within a series of 5 weeks time. So, it's kind of anybody's guess as far as when that official CBO score might come out. House leadership is signaling that they're going to aim for a vote on the budget reconciliation package the week of November 15th. At the federal level, the coalition and partners, we're working with both our House and Senate champions to make some technical corrections to the legislation as it has been released by the House. And, if and when the House passes the budget reconciliation measure, because it's a budget reconciliation measure and only requires 50 votes, it has to go through the Senate parliamentarian to make sure that it is in accordance with what's called the Byrd Rule for language and programs that really truly relate to budget reconciliation. So, I'd like to say that one of us has a crystal ball relative to what might happen, but I think it's anybody's guess. Hopefully by the end of the year, we will see a budget reconciliation measure. We are fairly confident based on what we've seen released from the House and what they might vote on, and where our Senate champions are at, that the vast majority of what we are working on from a policy perspective will be included in final legislation. So I think with that, Emma and Matt, that is the conclusion of my slides.
I'll go next. My name is Clay Crozier. I am the Eastern Utah Director for Senator Mitt Romney's office. I handle a large portion of our energy and natural resource related portfolio. And so I really appreciate Patrice going over a lot of those things in detail. First of all, I don't have a slide, so I'm sorry. You're just going to have to look at me. It'll be painful, but hopefully I can offer something that you can take away from this. About a little less than a year ago, I was at a conference, an energy conference here in the state with Alaire Emery, who used to work for the Governor's Office of Energy Development. And we received a presentation from a whole host of people talking about the importance that carbon capture and CCUS more generally is going to play in the future of our energy policy. I think from our perspective too, we saw that a lot of other states were getting on board with carbon capture and making it easier to have a regulatory framework so that people knew what they were getting into when they made their investments here in their states. And we noticed that Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Wyoming, some of these other states were much further along than Utah was in their carbon capture efforts. And so we had many further conversations, including ones with Antonio and Matt Anderson, about what we could do to get Utah up to speed on this and to get greater investment in this area in our state so that we could be a part of the solution. From Senator Romney's perspective, climate change is in his top 3 issues that he's concerned about for the United States in the coming century. When you look at climate change, you start to notice that if the United States did everything they could, if we were a net zero carbon country, global emissions over the next 100 years continue to go up because many of these countries, such as China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, they're developing and they will continue to emit at a greater pace than our reduction pace. And that's not a good thing. It doesn't solve the greenhouse gas issues going forward. And so how are we going to convince these nations that they need to reduce their greenhouse gases and be a part of the solution? And it's clear that anything we do must have a market-based solution to our greenhouse gas issues. And just telling them that they have to invest in solar and wind doesn't get there. India just announced at Glasgow this week that they were asked if they were going to quit building coal-fired power plants, and they said no, they're not. And why wouldn't you? Why would you deny your people the energy and you know, energy is directly related to poverty. Countries that have energy are generally less impoverished, and countries that don't have energy are more impoverished. So when we think about the climate change problem in that framework, carbon capture is going to play a unique and an essential role in how the globe and how the world moves forward in solving this problem. I think from a federal policy perspective, the stage has been set with the goals from the international community, and that was at the Paris Climate Accords. And they said there, all these nations came together and agreed that that we need to have a 2 degrees Celsius decrease in. So the Paris Climate's goal was to only increase global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius in the coming century. And so how do we get there? We've got to implement carbon capture into this effort. And from our perspective, what can we do from a federal Senate office? Well, a lot of the things that Patrice went over, the 45Q credit has played a key part. There have been a lot of criticisms that it doesn't do enough to economically make carbon capture viable. And so a lot of federal representatives are looking at this. For example, in the Build Back Better Act, which is the reconciliation bill Patrice alluded to, there's a 45Q credit extension in that bill, which not only extends it, but it increases the credit amount. And I believe she noted there are several different ways it works, but basically if you qualify for the full amount, it'll, instead of being $35 per metric ton for credit, it could go up as high as $85 per metric ton. Another thing that just passed in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is going to the president's desk as we speak was the Carbon Capture Improvement Act. So the top line for the Carbon Capture Improvement Act is that it leverages private activity bonds to make it easier for power plants and industrial facilities to finance their CCUS and direct air capture efforts. So it essentially allows carbon oxide capture facilities to qualify for these tax exempt bonds that are issued by the state or the local governments. And the point of the bill is to make financing these facilities less expensive. And like I said, that will be going to the president's desk. And I think too, it helps people shore up their investment in high emitting industries. And it makes it easier too, because they can go through their local government instead of having to go through the federal government. Some other things that was in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, which Senator Romney was a sponsor of, where it was funding for carbon capture demonstration projects. And there was also funding for 4 direct air capture hubs. So we talk about carbon capture oftentimes as things that are attached to facilities, but there's also this concept floating around of direct air capture, which I think it would be great to get one of those projects for the Salt Lake Valley. I mean, I can't think of a better place for it to be. And then there's also too financing and construction for CO2 transport and storage infrastructure projects. So Senator Romney is very supportive of direct air capture and carbon capture as it relates to facilities. New technologies and will lower costs, and that's what's going to help us reach our carbon capture and CO2 greenhouse gas goals as laid out in the Paris Climate Accords. The International Energy Association has released a report that says there's the potential to reduce carbon capture costs for carbon capture facilities by 30% over the next decade. So there are things that we're going to be looking at in there too to make this cheaper and more marketable. And as we develop this here in the United States, we also develop an export market where we can build these facilities here and then ship them to developing nations as they strive to attain these goals. I want to talk a little bit more about Build Back Better. It's not something that we're going to support from an office perspective, but there are things in there that people should know about. The 6-year extension of the 45Q credit is in there. I talked about how it's going to increase the credit amount, but it's something that there's broad interest in from all sides of the aisle. And with that, I just want to say, from our office's perspective, we want to work with you. We want to help your project. So if you have any questions or any way that we can be helpful from a congressional perspective, please feel free to reach out. And that's all I've got.
I'll go next from a state policy, if that's okay. I've got to hit the road and head to Salt Lake. My name's Carl Albrecht. I'm a legislator in the Utah State House of Representatives, and I've been there almost 6 years. I spent 40 years in the electric utility business, and so I have some idea about what you folks are all talking about. I can say that I was, excuse me, very impressed with the presentations that have been made today. Utah is a pretty amazing state when you consider the geology that we have and where the carbon could be stored. It's just, it's a geological wonder, really. We've, from a policy standpoint, we've had 2 or 3 presentations to our legislative committee. I'm the chair of the Public Utilities, Energy and Technology Committee on carbon sequestration the last couple of years. We had one recently to our interim committee. Our interim committee is made up of both senators and representatives. And there are people who are interested in putting CCS facilities in Utah, the Carbon County area. We also have the San Rafael Energy Research Center over in Emery County that's interested in doing some of this work. And so I feel like Utah, we're very well positioned for future developments in this area. It's a matter of economics, I guess you could say. Utah has a very low electric rates, energy rates when compared to the rest of the United States, which has in turn helped our economy grow considerably. And we're in all of the above state right now. Our state energy policy, which I amended last year, added some items to it, hydrogen, pump storage, and some other areas. But we still believe that, wind and solar and renewables on any given day will not meet the demand until we get utility scale grid battery storage, and that technology is just not caught up yet. But we'd like to continue with our coal and natural gas plants because they provide a firm foundation to our energy portfolio, and we don't want to get in a situation that California had or Texas had. We want power that's reasonable, dispatchable at a given moment in a crisis like that, that will provide the energy that we need. So very much interested in CCS. There's appears to be many folks working on this in the state of Utah. Again, I will say I was impressed with the presentations, and from the state's policymakers' position, eager to work with you because we know this has to take place. But bear in mind what Clay Crozier said from Senator Romney's office. You know, in the United States, we can do so much. In Utah, we've done quite a bit to clean up our air and to clean up our power plants, both natural gas and coal. And we need to continue that. But somehow we have to convince those foreign nations that are developing, the Chinas, the Russias, the Indias, so on and so forth, to do their part. But appreciated the presentations that have been made today. Look forward to working with any of you that would like to come to our committee and make a presentation. And appreciate the State Energy Office for putting this together. So I'll get on the road to Salt Lake City. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. So I'm Matt Fry, back with GPI, and I will take it to a broader perspective on state and regional policy as things stand at this time. So if I can get the next slide, please. So just a little bit of background on potential state opportunities and policy. What we've got going with GPI to work on those policy initiatives across the country. Back in 2015, GPI worked with then Governor Meade, then Governor Bullock of Montana to put together the State Carbon Capture Work Group. This is a group that works kind of in a nonpartisan manner to help develop policy recommendations to move forward to deploy these technologies across the country. And along with many folks at the time, the State Carbon Capture Work Group was pretty was very supportive of the 45Q tax credit as was proposed and then passed in 2018. Next slide. Some of the work that was put out and provided a large number, myriad policy recommendations that states could look at are projected on this slide here. Our first was the putting the puzzle together document. It's a white paper that literally provides a broad menu of policy recommendations to move forward carbon capture. And at the point it was heavily focused on CO2 EOR. Also put together a policy paper on pipelines, and then that was followed by electric market design. As you folks know, electric markets are extremely complex, and folks felt that it was pretty important that we look at potential policy opportunities to move forward with CCUS in this regulated electricity markets. And then finally put together the ethanol paper. Ethanol is extremely low hanging fruit for CO2 capture. It comes out of the stack at about 99% efficient. So thought it would be a good idea to look at potential opportunities to move in this area as well. Next slide. Following on those initiatives, the governors decided there'd be a good idea to look at this as more of a regional issue. State specific, you can't really cover the issue and address the climate impacts that you could when you look at it at a regional level. So we started the Regional Carbon Capture Limited Initiative, or the RDI. And these states work together, as you can see here, in a regional way to put forward policy recommendations that could be implemented once again to further deploy these technologies. And at this point, we're at about 500 state officials and so forth that are participating in the RDI. Next slide. One of the major accomplishments of the RDI was a multi-year analysis that put forward opportunities or disclosed opportunities for both near and midterm development and deployment of CCUS projects, as well as actually mapped out the potential pathways for transport across the country. As you can see from this slide, we use a lot of different data, and both our analytical team within GPI, as well as a number of other constituents, worked on this information or this analysis for about 2 years. Next slide, please. In considering current data and current policy that had been talked about previously, the result of this analysis was the report that you can capture, and I believe Emma can probably put an active link in the chat for you, but it did just what we had come out and proposed to do, brought forward both a roadmap for development scenarios, as well as additional analysis for jobs. Next slide. And this is what the analysis looks like at the national scale. You can see both the emitting facilities based on their criteria, what they do specifically, as well as their qualifications under 45Q. And then you can see the current existing CO2 infrastructure and the potential movement of CO2 in the future to take all of this, or I should say carbon oxide, from source to sink. Next. And these are some opportunities or some ref materials that folks can look at that were also presented or provided by this analysis. We have state-specific analysis rules, as well as our job and economic input, which folks can take a look at their opportunity or at their leisure. Next slide. And just wanted to touch on this real quickly. At this point, there's 8 states who've signed on to a memorandum of understanding to work together on CO2 transport infrastructure and deployment opportunities. Basically, what it does is provide a platform for these states to come together and bounce ideas off of each other, potential ways that they can better facilitate working together on project deployment. And then last month, the group of states released an action plan. And I'd suggest, if you get the time, you might want to take a look at that, because from a state perspective, this action plan provides both federal and state incentives in a menu form. We don't pretend that we could make policy specific recommendations for each state just because everybody's got their own political interests and as well as economic interests that they need to address internally. But it's a really good, robust document of policy recommendations that folks can look at to help themselves move forward in this CO2 or CCUS project deployment. No. And I won't get too much into these slides just because their previous, I guess, segment 2 with the infrastructure got so in depth with these, but our analytical team put together some information that just kind of looks at potential near-term and mid-term deployment opportunities based on sources and sinks in the Utah area, as well as existing infrastructure. So you saw this in a much more technical presentation earlier, but just wanted to share what our analysis looked like and how very similar they are. So with that, I will move on to questions. Thank you. Antonio, are there any questions in the queue that we need to address?
Right now, we don't have any questions on the chat. There have been some questions in the chat that have been replied in the same chat. Is there anything else, any more questions to any of our panelists? Please feel free to send it on our way. Right, we have one question. Will the Hunter project move forward to a pilot? And what's the next step?
It looks like Mike might be typing an answer to that, but I could give a bit of a verbal on that one. When we looked at that particular project, I think at that time the Department of Energy was really looking for projects that were a bit further along in the process, and more ready to capture CO2 and store it. And at the time we did the pre-feasibility study, the Hunter plant didn't have capture equipment lined up yet. So that was one of the reasons we didn't have a ready capture source. And so that's why we didn't move beyond that pre-feasibility study. The Department of Energy picked a couple other projects across the country that were further along in their readiness index than we were. So that was kind of why that one didn't move much forward. It would be something great to revisit if we, as in Utah and in general, decide to keep Hunter and Huntington power plants running. This is something we might want to go back and look at capturing that and fitting. But from my initial take on that is that we may be retiring those plants in the near future, so that might not be a worthwhile endeavor.
Looks like there's another question. Oh, I think it was just answered on well primacy. Oh, looks like it was answered.
I could give a little bit of take on that, and maybe Rich Esser could chime in as well. We do have a colleague we're working with at EGI who is actively trying to bring this Class 6 primacy issue before the state of Utah, and he's actually working to try and gain primacy for our state. We're using, I believe, with the Wyoming template to follow as a kind of a guideline, just because there isn't many. It's just Wyoming and North Dakota, I believe, that have primacy. I may be mistaken about that, but I think we're following the Wyoming's model to try and gain primacy here in Utah.
That is correct.
Comment a little more on that. So the reason Wyoming and North Dakota have primacy is they wrote it into their Antiquities Act when they worked with the government, and nobody else got that right. So, and that'll be a big lift, but it would make sense to try to make that happen. However, you have to make that happen. A little feeds into the state versus federal discussion that we have prominently in Utah on an ongoing basis. But in either case, though, the bottom line is, how do we secure and no matter who has primacy, we still need to make sure we have the technologies, and the other people that have spoken here today are more expert than I on that. But my impression is that we actually have pretty good technologies for securing CO2 underground in an appropriately built well. We don't have good technologies for sloppily done work that they could end up being catastrophic from both releasing all the CO2 you thought you captured and potentially from a health threat if it's not done right. So
this is Patrice, just to chime in on Class 6. So, you're correct that both North Dakota and Wyoming have achieved primacy to oversee Class 6 wells. The state of Louisiana has an application pending in front of the EPA currently, and the state of Texas is also close to submitting their application for primacy. There are several other states that are interested in doing the same. The Carbon Capture Coalition is working to make sure that there are additional appropriations that go to the federal UIC program and also to regions and states to help support staff knowledge build out and the like, as everyone is expecting that there will be a lot of well applications across the country to utilize Class 6. And then just two last things. One, the EPA was mandated to produce a report, which is due by the end of the year, on the status of Class 6 and what they see working and not working. So, maybe pay attention to that, especially as you look to explore primacy there. And then finally, the Groundwater Protection Council is coming out with a curriculum related to Class 6 that might be useful as you explore the Wyoming model and others to help educate people at the state level. Thank you.
if I could respond to some of the comments that are coming up about the lifetime of the coal plants. So under current plans, the Utah coal plants actually have longer lives than any of the ones in Wyoming. But they're all going to close. So it would be hard for me to imagine somebody making the hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in these coal plants with the current schedule that Pacific Corp has for closing those plants. And IPP is closing even earlier. So if coal plants are the target, somebody should be working pretty closely with Pacific Corp and with the states to make those viable long enough that it would make sense to invest in a carbon capture plant. But also in the comments, there's a suggestion that most of those are being replaced by natural gas, which is correct in the short term in the case of IPP, but in the long term, probably in the case of many of the other plants. And that changes. So natural gas emits CO2 as well. Emits CO2 at a much lower concentration than coal plants do, and changes the technology that we do. So strategically, I would say there are kind of two things to look at. One is to start focusing more on natural gas emission rather than coal emission, there's no reason you can't do both. But the second would be to try to work with Pacific Corp and see if there are ways that some of these coal emitters in the region, in Utah in particular, if their lifetimes could be extended in their planning so that it would make sense to invest the sizable amount of money that it's going to take to do carbon capture.
Right. Is there any more questions? Appreciate our panelists answering some questions in the chat. Let's see. With no more questions, we will turn things over Matt Anderson to wrap things up.
Great, thank you, Antonio. I want to give a big shout out again to the Great Plains Institute for helping to put this on. We really appreciate them. And also thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your time and expertise throughout this webinar. This was wonderful and very insightful. It's clear that we have very capable people working on this technology, and I'm hopeful we can continue working with one another and we'll be able to see the adoption of CCUS in Utah. As with all technologies, there's challenges to overcome, but with businesses and interest groups working together, we can make this a reality. Thanks again for your participation, and please feel free to reach out to our office or any of our panelists or Great Plains Institute if there's anything that we can help you with. And everyone have a great day. Thank you.